Hello everyone. Before we get started, make sure to like and subscribe, and leave a comment saying where you're from and when you watched. That way, YouTube will continue to show you stories like this. Now, let's get started. Asterisk, I always thought I understood my wife better than anyone else in the world. We had been married for 6 years, going through all the ups and downs of our marriage. Emily was gentle, sweet, and almost never bothered me. But a month ago, I began to notice something strange. At night, when she slept, there were times when she started whispering. At first I thought it was just her sleep talking, a normal phenomenon. But the more I listened, the more I realized that the voice was not Emily's. It was deeper, more hoarse, and sounded like a grown man's voice. Sometimes like a stranger's. The first night I noticed, I woke up at 3 in the morning. It was pouring rain outside, the sound of the rain mixed with the sound of the wind, making the normally quiet room strangely gloomy. I turned to see Emily lying on her side, breathing regularly, but whispering sounds came from her lips. At first it was just nonsense, but then I heard a very clear sentence in English, but the voice was not hers. He is watching us. I remember every word because the sound gave me goosebumps. I sat up, turned on the nightlight, and gently shook my wife's shoulder. Emily opened her eyes with a start, looking confused. I asked her what she had just said, but she just looked at me as if she didn't understand what was going on. From that day on, I started to pay more attention. And then, almost every night, Emily talked in her sleep. Sometimes it was nonsense, sometimes it was long sentences. But the scariest thing was that it all came out with that strange voice. Another night, I heard clearly, "You cannot stop me." The voice was deep, resonant as if it came from some deep cavity, not my wife's throat. I tried to record it on my phone. When I played it the next morning, my whole body was cold. It was a man's voice, unmistakable. I told Emily about this, and she thought I was joking at first. But when I played her the recording, her face turned pale. She shook her head repeatedly, saying she couldn't believe it. Emily had never spoken like that, and had no memory of those nights. I could see the fear in her eyes, and deep down I knew something was wrong with my family. That Saturday night, I couldn't sleep. I lay quietly beside her, trying to stay awake. As I had expected, around 3 in the morning, Emily began to whisper. But this time it was different. The strange voice rang out, but it wasn't just isolated sentences anymore. It was a long sentence, as if she was talking to someone in the room. I strained my ears to listen, and my heart almost stopped when I heard her say, "He is awake. He can hear us. But it doesn't matter. Soon, he will join us." I almost jumped out of bed, hurriedly turning on the light. Emily opened her eyes, but instead of her usual sleepy expression, her eyes stared at me, empty and cold. For just a few seconds, I felt like it wasn't my wife, but someone else looking through those eyes. I trembled and called her name, and then, as if waking up from a sleepwalking dream, Emily blinked, asking me why I was looking at her like that. I didn't know how to answer. In the following days, I began to research. I read documents about sleep talking, about sleep disorders, about related psychological phenomena. But no medical documents could explain why a person could speak in a completely different voice, with such strange illusions. And then I found a forum sharing horror stories of people who had witnessed similar scenes. Some said it was a manifestation of an underlying mental disorder, but there were others, with a more mysterious tone, claiming it was a sign of a supernatural presence. I didn't know what to believe. But one thing I knew for sure: our home no longer felt safe. Ever since I discovered the strange voice in Emily's sleep, I've been living in a constant state of tension. During the day, she was still a normal, gentle wife, but at night it was completely different. I started keeping a tape recorder next to the bed because I wanted to have concrete evidence to understand what was going on. The first night I recorded my wife's entire sleep. The next morning, when I played it back, I felt like my blood was freezing in my veins. Over the course of 8 hours, the strange voice rang out at least 12 times. It wasn't just short sentences like before, but long, clear passages as if talking to another person in the room. In particular, there was one sentence that I would never forget, because it sounded like it came from somewhere far away. We remember the fire. We remember the screams. I immediately stopped the tape and looked around the room, as if hoping to find traces of an invisible intruder. I began to think that this was one of those ghost stories people tell about spirits that never leave. The thought made me breathless. I tried to keep my sanity by seeing a psychiatrist. The doctor suggested that Emily might have a sleep disorder or a subconscious obsession, but he couldn't explain why the voice was so different, even sounding like that of a grown man. I decided not to tell Emily about the recording, fearing she might be haunted, but my heart grew more and more uneasy. A week later, I woke up again at 3 a.m. The room was dark, except for the sound of rain outside the window, and then I heard it. It wasn't just Emily's voice, but I heard another voice whispering back. Vague, but enough for me to realize it wasn't a hallucination. It was as if there were two people in my room conversing in some mysterious language, one low-pitched, one higher-pitched. I held my breath, strained my eyes to look around, but saw no one. In that moment, Emily turned around, her eyes wide open, but I immediately realized that the look was not hers. Her eyes were cold, lifeless, and the corners of her lips curled up into a vague smile. Then that strange voice spoke again through my wife's mouth. "He knows too much." I trembled and called her name, but after a few seconds, her eyes softened, and Emily seemed to have no memory of what had happened. She asked why I woke up in the middle of the night, and I could only shake my head. From that day on, I became obsessed. I started reading many ghost stories online. Stories about people living with ghosts, whispers at night, figures appearing in mirrors. The more I read, the more I saw my situation as identical. Some people on the forum asserted that if the voice came from a loved one in their sleep but was completely different, it was a sign that some soul had found a door to borrow a body. That thought kept me awake for many nights. One night, I tried to put a few infrared cameras in the bedroom, facing our bed. I thought that if anything unusual happened, the cameras would record it. That night, when I watched the video, my heart stopped. The moment Emily started whispering, behind her, the darkness seemed to move. In a few blurry frames, I saw a tall, thin, transparent figure standing close to the bed, head bowed as if listening to her. When lightning from the thunderstorm flashed outside the window, a blurry face appeared, eyes white and lifeless. I sat motionless in front of the screen, my throat choked. I believed that my wife and I were not alone in this house. There was some entity, invisible but existing, whispering every night through Emily's voice. I knew this was no longer a matter of medicine or psychology, but a mystery beyond human understanding. And I also know I've only begun to scratch the surface of something much more terrifying that lurks beneath. After reviewing the camera footage of the shadowy figure standing right behind Emily, I could no longer deny it. There was an entity in this house, a presence I did not invite, but it appeared every night, observing and whispering. I lived in a state of extreme tension. My eyes were dark from lack of sleep, always feeling like someone was watching me from the dark. Even when I went to work, I could only think about the bedroom and what was happening every night. I did not dare tell anyone except my wife, but Emily herself began to feel strange things. She said that recently she often woke up in the middle of the night with a cold feeling down her spine, as if someone was standing right next to her bed looking down at her. She also admitted that sometimes she heard very light footsteps in the hallway, but when she opened the door, she only saw darkness. One night, I decided to stay up all night to monitor. The room was quiet, except for the sound of rain falling outside the window and the ticking of the clock. Around 3 in the morning, Emily began to move. Her breathing changed. Then from her lips, the strange voice rang out again, this time clearer than ever. "He is closer now. He is almost here." I shivered, sat up straight, and looked around the room. The space was immersed in thick darkness, but I could feel the cold air swirling around. In the mirror opposite the bed, I caught a glimpse of a faint silhouette, tall and thin eyes, like bottomless pits. I quickly turned my head, but saw nothing. The next day, I began to learn about the history of this house. I contacted the oldest neighbor in the neighborhood, Mr. Johnson. When I asked, he was silent for a long time, then lowered his voice and said that our house had been burned down more than 40 years ago. A family of 4 lived here, but no one escaped. The father, according to rumors, was involved in evil rituals, and many people believed that the family's spirit had never left this place. I shuddered at that. Emily's whispers had mentioned fire, had mentioned screams. It all fit together in a creepy way. That night, I told Emily what Mr. Johnson had said. She turned pale, her hands were shaking. Emily started crying, saying she was scared, that every time she closed her eyes, she felt like she was being seen through by a pair of eyes. I held her tight, but I knew deep down we couldn't hide forever. Something in this house was trying to get closer to us every day. The next night, things got worse. At 3 in the morning, when Emily started talking in her sleep, the strange voice rang out. I felt the air in the room change, thick and cold like an invisible fog. I turned on my phone and turned on the recording mode. And then, I heard not just one, but many voices, like a conversation between invisible people. A deep voice, a whisper, and a voice like a child's. Emily lay still, her eyes closed, but her mouth uttered words that sounded like prayers, and her voice was not hers. I wanted to shake her awake, but my whole body was frozen, unable to move. Suddenly, a loud banging sound came from the door, 3 times in a row, then silence. I wanted to scream, but my throat was tight. When it was morning, I checked the camera. In the recording, when the voice rang out, the door shook slightly, as if someone was outside trying to get in. But no one appeared. I sat in front of the screen for hours, with only one thought in my head. We were not just being harassed, but being hunted. This was not simply sleep talking, but a portal was slowly opening, connecting this house to the spirits that had never left. When I told this to a friend who worked at the town library, he advised me to leave the house immediately. But Emily refused, saying that leaving would only make things worse, that they might have already chosen us. Those words haunted me for days. I began to believe that this house was not just a place to live, but a box containing the remnants of a terrible tragedy from the past. And we were just the next to be caught in that vortex. Every night, I felt the house breathing with us. Every wall, every door, whispering secrets. And I knew the real nightmare was only just beginning. After several nights of hearing Emily's strange voice, I began to realize that the change didn't just happen at night. During the day, I sometimes found her sitting silently for hours, her eyes staring into the distance as if she were lost in another world. When I called her name, it took a few seconds for Emily to wake up, her eyes hazy as if she had just woken up from a deep dream. I tried to convince myself that it was just fatigue, but deep down I knew this house was doing something to us. One evening, I came home tired from work and found the door wide open. In the living room, the sofa was pulled askew. The curtains were shaking violently, even though there was no wind. I called Emily's name loudly, but no one answered. As I walked up the stairs, I heard a whisper coming down. It wasn't Emily's voice, but the familiar, deep, husky male voice I had heard when she slept. I walked quickly, my heart pounding. Opening the bedroom door, I saw Emily standing in front of the mirror, her lips moving, but the sound that came out did not match her movements. It was as if another voice was using her body to speak. When I called her name, Emily turned around, her face pale, but the look in her eyes was not my wife's. In that moment, I saw the cold, lifeless look, like a stranger looking through familiar eyes. I rushed to hug her, shook her hard, and called out. Emily fell to her knees, her eyes tightly closed. When she opened her eyes, she was panting as if she had just run through a nightmare. She asked what had just happened, and I did not know how to answer. I was filled with terrible fear, because I had witnessed with my own eyes something that no doctor or scientist could explain. That night, I set up the camera again and recorded. When I played it back, the sound gave me goosebumps. There was a clear whispering sound, but it was a man's voice, and in the background, a vague sound like a child's giggle. The laughter lasted for a few seconds, echoing as if from the corner of the room, where the camera only recorded a patch of darkness. I rewinded the sound over and over again, but every time I listened, my spine prickled. The next day, I showed the recording to a friend who worked in the paranormal research field. He listened intently, his face gradually turning pale. Finally, he said, what I recorded could be evidence of a multi-layered presence, meaning that multiple spirits or entities were coexisting in this space. He advised me to leave the house immediately, but I knew it was not that simple. Emily was becoming more and more attached to them, as if she were a door they were using. If I left, would they let her go? At the same time, Emily began to have recurring dreams. She said that in her dreams, she saw a room full of fire, screaming and shadows running around. At the end of the dream, there was always a cold hand grabbing hers and pulling her towards the darkness. I listened with a heartache. Those dreams matched the whispers I had heard while she slept. Clearly, the memories of the souls who had died in the fire were creeping into Emily's subconscious as time went on. The house showed more and more unusual signs. Lights flickered in the middle of the night, knocking on the door repeatedly at 3 in the morning. Small objects in the house changed positions, even though no one had touched them. I tried recording with many different devices, and each time there was something unusual: sighs, the sound of a hand tapping on the wall. One night the camera even recorded a dark shadow standing at the head of the bed, staring down at us for 5 minutes. I felt like I was trapped in a story that people often call scary stories. But this time, not to listen to it for fun, but to live it every day and every hour. I thought about going to an exorcist, but in my head, I heard the whispers that I heard from a strange voice through my wife's mouth. It is too late. Every time I remembered, I felt like my blood was freezing. I don't know how much longer we can endure, but I am sure of one thing. That invisible door is opening little by little, and the other side has begun to creep into our world. After a series of sleepless nights, I began to notice that the house was no longer the safe haven it had been before. Every step in the hallway, every dark corner in the living room made me feel like someone was watching. During the day, when the light was abundant, I still felt an invisible presence lurking somewhere. One time, I was working in the office downstairs when I heard slow footsteps on the second floor. I thought Emily was there, but when I ran upstairs, the house was quiet, the door was closed. I turned around and saw the chair in the bedroom had moved from its original position, leaving a light scratch on the wooden floor. Emily also began to feel uneasy. She often sat up in the middle of the night, her eyes wide open but lifeless. When I asked, she couldn't remember anything. There were mornings when she said that in her dreams. She saw herself standing in the house, but all the doors had disappeared, replaced by a dark wall. From behind, there were long, faceless shadows, just standing still, watching. Listening to her story, I felt like my heart was being squeezed, because I had also seen similar things flashing in the mirror at night. One night, when I was trying to sleep, a strange noise came from the hallway. The night light was flickering, and then I heard a long whisper, as if many voices were mingling. I stepped out into the hallway, my heart pounding. The darkness was thick, but at the end of the hallway, right next to the window, I saw a blurry figure standing there. It was unusually tall, with a slender body, its long arms reaching almost to its knees. I couldn't see its face clearly, only its empty eyes glowing dimly. When I stepped back, the figure disappeared, leaving only a giggle echoing around the house. The next morning, I checked the camera placed in the hallway. At 3:11, the camera caught a dark shadow moving slowly from the top of the stairs to the bedroom door. But the terrifying thing was that the shadow had no clear shape. It was like a thick, black smoke floating. When it reached the door, it stood still for minutes before disappearing. I watched the footage over and over again, each time feeling a chill down my spine. I told Emily about this. She burst into tears. She said she clearly felt like she was being watched, even when she was showering or changing clothes. Many times, she saw her reflection in the mirror move a few seconds slower than her real movements, as if there was another entity imitating her. I couldn't reassure her, because I was experiencing the same feeling. This house was becoming more and more creepy, turning every peaceful moment into a suffocating obsession. Another evening, as I walked around the house checking the windows and main door, I heard a light tapping on the wall. At first it was just one beat, then three, steady and deliberate. I pressed my ear to the wall but heard nothing more. But when I left, the knocking started again, louder this time. I hurriedly called Emily down, but when she arrived, the sound was gone. We looked at each other, neither of us saying a word, but both of us knew that this house had another uninvited intruder. The next night, Emily woke up in a panic. She said a cold hand grabbed her ankle and pulled it down. I turned on the light and saw a finger-shaped bruise on her ankle. I took a picture as evidence, but that only made me more helpless. We had no idea what to do but wait each night out, in utter fear. I began to think about leaving the house, but deep down I feared that this would no longer be confined within the four walls. The darkness had found a way to touch Emily, and I feared that if we left, it would still follow. The biggest question was how to stop it. Before it got out of hand, I knew one thing. Each night, the darkness grew thicker, and the house was no longer ours. It belonged to the invisible watchers, who had begun to come out of the door Emily had accidentally opened. After days of living in fear, I realized that what we had experienced was far beyond the concept of a dream or a hallucination. This house was hiding a bloody history that we had only just touched the surface of. I decided to go back to the library to learn more. In old newspapers, I discovered information about a fire that had burned down the house in the 1970s. 4 people died that night, including a couple and their 2 small children. The newspaper at that time mentioned rumors that the man in the family was involved in evil rituals, but there was no concrete evidence. Coincidentally, the whispers Emily uttered in her sleep all mentioned fire, screaming, and pain. When I brought this information home, Emily burst into tears. She said that in her recent dreams, she often saw herself standing in the middle of a burning room, with 2 children hugging her legs, begging for help. But behind her, a man's voice called out, urging her to stay, saying they belonged together. Hearing those words, I shivered. The images and voices in Emily's dreams matched the details I found, as if the past was resurrected through her mind. As time went on, I felt Emily being pulled toward the darkness. During the day, she began to mumble nonsense, sometimes stopping mid-work and staring into space. When I asked, she said she heard someone calling from afar. At night, the strange voice in her sleep no longer just whispered, but sometimes screamed angrily, making me shake awake. I realized this was no longer just creepy or fabricated stories on the internet. This was one of the true scary stories happening right in my life. One evening, when I decided to put a sensitive microphone in my room, I recorded a part that almost made me drop the device. In it, while Emily was sleeping, a male voice rang out clearly, "Get out." The voice did not come from far away, but came from right in the room, right next to the bed. I listened to it over and over again, and the more I listened, the more the echoes became dry and resentful, as if the owner of that voice was still full of anger over the death in the fire years ago. The next day, I brought the recording to my friend who researched the supernatural. After listening, his face was drained of color. He said that I was facing an entity that did not want us there. And the truth was, even more terrible, Emily might have been chosen as the door for them to return. If I did not find a way to stop it, this situation could become irreparable. That night, I tried to confront her directly. When Emily started talking in her sleep again, I held her hand, looked straight into my wife's face. Her eyes were closed, but her mouth spoke words that did not belong to her. I shouted, asking the hidden person to let go, but immediately, Emily opened her eyes. That look paralyzed me, empty and full of hatred. She whispered in that male voice, "You cannot stop us." I trembled and let go of my hand, and Emily collapsed on the bed. The next morning, she did not remember anything, but her body was tired, as if she had just gone through a battle. The house became more and more dangerous. Every night there were footsteps, the sound of creaking doors, even though no one touched them. The shadows that passed by became clearer and clearer, to the point that I no longer dared to turn off all the lights. But the most terrifying thing was that I began to feel the hatred aimed directly at me. Several times, when I walked through the hallway, I heard a whisper, "Leave her." That voice was full of threats, as if it wanted me to disappear so that Emily could belong completely to them. I knew clearly that I could not abandon my wife, but I also understood that we had entered a vortex that was not easy to escape. This story had gone beyond the limits of reason, turning into a real nightmare, and now I can only wait to see if the darkness will swallow us completely. Ever since I heard the threatening voice forcing me to leave Emily, I knew that the presence in this house was no longer just a threat. It had a clear purpose, and its goal was to take my wife. I began to see a clear change in Emily. She became distant, often sitting silently for hours without blinking. Sometimes I caught her standing in front of the mirror, her mouth moving as if she was talking to someone on the other side. When I asked, she just smiled faintly and said she didn't remember anything. But in that look, I recognized the strangeness, a darkness growing and gradually covering the woman I loved. One night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps in the living room. I took the flashlight and walked down the stairs in silence. When the light passed, I was stunned. Emily was standing in the middle of the living room, but she was not alone. Beside her were three blurry figures: a tall man, a long-haired woman, and two small, childlike figures. Everyone stood in a line, staring at me with blank, lifeless eyes. I was so stunned that I almost fell, my heart pounding like it was about to rip out of my chest. I shouted my wife's name, but immediately the light flashed and everything disappeared, leaving only Emily collapsed on the floor, gasping for breath as if someone had squeezed her. I rushed to help her up, but her whole body was cold as ice. I called an ambulance, but when the paramedics arrived, they said she was completely normal, just exhausted. Emily woke up. Her eyes were blank. She whispered to me that they had returned and that they wanted her to come with them. Hearing those words, I felt utterly hopeless. Obviously, the souls who died in the fire years ago had not left, but were still lingering in the house, pulling Emily deeper into their world. After that incident, I went back to find Mr. Johnson, the old neighbor. He reluctantly told me more about the past. He said that after the fire, many people who used to live nearby claimed to still see the family's shadow at night, especially the sound of children crying from the ruins. Some people believe that the father performed an evil ritual, forcing the family's spirits to stay in the house forever. Hearing that, I felt like the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together. Emily was not randomly chosen. Maybe she had some weakness that the spirits took advantage of to return. I decided to try another way. I placed the recorder all over the house, from the living room to the hallway and the bedroom. The next morning, when I played it back, I heard creepy noises. In the living room, there was the sound of children laughing. In the hallway, there was the sound of heavy footsteps walking. And in the bedroom, in the middle of the night, a man's voice whispered, "She is ours." Those words were like a knife stabbing deep into my heart. They not only haunted me, but also clearly declared their intentions. Emily grew weaker and weaker. She was often tired, her face pale, her eyes dark. One day she said she felt herself being dragged to the floor, unable to move, and when she woke up, her whole body ached. I looked at her body covered in bruises, as if someone had grabbed her limbs in the night. I knew I couldn't sit still and wait. In desperation, I went to a priest at the local church. He listened to me tell my story, his face serious. He said that what I described was not just a single supernatural phenomenon, but a sign of a possession. He warned that if nothing was done, Emily could lose control completely, and there would be no way to save her. I returned home in utter fear. I watched my wife sleep, her face gentle but her lips moving slightly. The strange voice rang out again. This time, it was no longer a whisper, but a loud, creepy laugh that echoed throughout the room. I knew it. They were right there, and the real battle had just begun. After the meeting with the priest, I began to prepare for what might happen. But that very night, everything went beyond my imagination. Around 3 in the morning, I woke up to the sound of giggling right next to my ear. I turned on the light, but there was no one but Emily sleeping. She was still breathing evenly, but the corners of her lips were slightly raised, her eyes half open with a lifeless look. From those lips, a hoarse male voice rang out, saying with cruel sarcasm, "You cannot save her. She belongs to us." I was frozen, unable to speak, only able to watch my wife turn into a puppet of the spirits in the darkness. I rushed to shake her awake, but at that moment, the whole room shook. The lights flickered continuously, the windows banged loudly as if an invisible hand was hitting them. On the wall, black streaks began to spread like smoke, flickering to form human shapes. I saw a scorched face, empty eyes, and a gaping mouth, screaming incoherently. The scream echoed in my head, not in my ears. I held Emily tightly, trying to scream a prayer, but my voice was lost in the chaos. Suddenly, everything stopped. Emily collapsed on the bed, gasping for breath. I looked around, only the cracked wall with a few scratches like fingernails. I knew I had just faced something undeniable, a real nightmare that had stepped out of the night and lived in this house. This was no longer the ghost story people told each other. This was one of those true horror stories that happened right before my eyes. The next morning, Emily woke up but remembered nothing. I looked at her, my heart aching. I had to decide, either find a way to confront it or leave. But leaving was no longer the solution, because I felt it was tied to Emily. She said that in her dream. She was standing in the middle of a burning house, and this time she was no longer just watching, but also feeling the flames. She screamed, but the voice that came out was not hers. I knew clearly that as the days passed, the boundary between her and those spirits became more blurred. I decided to try something different. I put candles and read prayers in the bedroom when Emily went to sleep. At first, the room was silent, but after a few minutes, the candle flickered violently, then went out. Cold air rushed in. Emily sat up, eyes wide open, mouth laughing, but the voice that came out did not belong to her. "You think you can cast us out?" The sound echoed, like many voices mixed together, giving me goosebumps. I held the cross in my hand, reading on, but Emily laughed. The laughter echoed throughout the room. Then she collapsed, her body shaking, and finally fainted. I called the emergency room in a panic, but when the doctor arrived, they couldn't find anything wrong, just that she was exhausted. I began to doubt myself. Was I losing my mind, or was this really evidence of a sinister force? I reviewed the footage from that night, and what appeared almost made me drop the camera. When the candle went out, a tall, dark figure appeared right behind Emily. 2 long arms wrapped around her shoulders, and her face was burning like hot coals. It looked straight into the lens, its eyes glowing in the darkness. I turned off the camera immediately, but the image was etched in my mind forever. There was no safe place in the house. Footsteps followed me down to the kitchen, whispers echoed from the bathroom, and laughter echoed in the hallway. Emily was getting weaker, sometimes looking at me with a strange, cold gaze, as if I were the enemy. I knew that if I didn't act soon, I would lose her forever. But how do you act when your enemies are not people, but souls trapped in a bloody tragedy with each passing night? I only see the darkness thicken, and deep down I know This nightmare has only just begun. From the night Emily laughed in a strange voice, I knew that we had entered the most dangerous phase. This house was no longer just a shelter for a small family, but had become a giant trap where darkness and evil spirits resided. During the day, the sunlight was still abundant, but it did not make me feel safer. Every time I walked through the hallway, I always felt like I was walking through an invisible tunnel full of watching eyes. The shadows only appeared briefly in the corner of my eyes, but it was enough to make me shiver. Emily was increasingly haggard. Her dreams became so clear and repetitive that she lost sleep. Her body gradually weakened. One afternoon, I heard a childish laughter coming from the bedroom. I rushed up, opened the door. The room was empty. Only Emily was sitting curled up on the bed, trembling, saying that there were 2 children standing right next to her, holding her hand tightly and refusing to let go. I looked around. There was no one, but the cold feeling covered the whole room. I took her out, but as we walked down the stairs, the sound of children's footsteps echoed behind us, slow but clear. That night, I decided to walk around the house with a lit candle, hoping to find where they were hiding. When I reached the end of the hallway, the candle suddenly went out, and in the darkness, I heard breathing close to my ear. I turned around, but saw only empty space. When I turned on the flashlight again, I was stunned. There were long black handprints on the wall, imprinted as if they had just been burned. I touched them, and a layer of ash fell down, and a burning smell rose up. Emily saw it, screamed, and collapsed to the floor, her eyes wide open, unblinking. It took me a few minutes to pull her out of that state of panic. The next day, I reviewed the camera footage. When I entered the hallway, I was not alone. On the screen, 4 black figures moved parallel to me, 3 standing behind and 1 standing right next to Emily. The image was blurry, but enough for me to see a scorched face, eyes glowing in the darkness. When I turned around, everything was gone. I almost threw the device to the floor because I couldn't bear the fact that they were around me. Every step, every breath, I realized that this house was like a trap. Every room, every door, every mirror was a window to another place. Emily said that in her dream, she walked into the bedroom, but when she opened the door, she found herself standing in a burning hallway. Screams echoed from all sides, and black hands dragged her into the darkness. I couldn't deny that what we were experiencing was no longer random, but a sick game of trapped souls. I tried leaving the house for a few days, taking Emily to stay with a friend. But to my horror, the strange phenomena continued. The first night in the new place, Emily started whispering in a strange voice again, this time more strongly. The lights went out, the windows flew open, and footsteps echoed throughout the apartment. My friend was scared and didn't dare let us stay any longer. I knew that once the door was opened, darkness would follow wherever we went. When I returned to the old house, I felt as if the house itself was welcoming us back. The atmosphere was thick, dense, and cold. I knew clearly that we were trapped in a trap from which we could not escape. The creepy stories I had heard turned out to be not just stories, but the reality I was living. And every day, the invisible string tightened around us, pushing Emily deeper into the embrace of darkness. In the following days, I almost could not recognize the house that used to be our home. The air was always heavy. Every dark corner seemed to be filled with the breath of another person. Emily was getting thinner and thinner. Her eyes were dark, but her gaze was strange, as if she belonged to another world. I tried to talk to her, but many times she answered with unclear sentences. Her voice changed, sometimes deep, sometimes hoarse, completely unlike her. I knew the darkness was taking over her little by little. One night, I was awakened by a strange noise in the bedroom. When I opened my eyes, I saw Emily sitting up straight, eyes closed but mouth wide open. From her throat, a terrifying scream rang out, not like a human voice, but like the scream of many voices overlapping each other. I rushed towards her in horror, but the cold wind blew in my face as if there was an invisible force blocking it. The lights in the room flickered continuously. On the wall appeared charred figures, rushing back and forth as if caught in the flames. I couldn't do anything but call out my wife's name in despair. Suddenly, Emily collapsed on the bed, breathing heavily, sweating all over. I held her tightly, my heart pounding, knowing that things were going further than I thought. The next day, I decided to find more evidence to prove to others that we weren't imagining things. I placed more cameras in several corners of the house and set them to record continuously. When I played them back, I was stunned. In the video, at the moment Emily screamed, black shadows appeared clearly. 4 or 5 entities moved around the bed. One of them looked straight at the camera, her face burned, her eyes glowing like hot coals. The sight made me gasp, my heart almost jumping out of my chest. I knew I was witnessing something undeniable. The souls of the family who died in the fire really existed in this house. Emily began to recount her dreams in more and more detail. She found herself standing with 4 figures in the burning room, but instead of panicking, she felt like she belonged there. 2 children held her hand, calling her mother, and the man standing behind her whispered that she didn't need to resist anymore. My blood froze as I listened. I realized they weren't just haunting her. They were trying to make Emily a part of their story. One evening, when I went down to the kitchen to get some water, I heard a steady tapping on the wall, 3 beats at a time, echoing through the hallway. I turned around, and in the darkness, I saw a tall figure standing at the end of the hallway, his eyes glowing. I held my breath, my heart pounding, and then the figure disappeared. When I returned to the bedroom, Emily was sitting on the bed, eyes wide open, whispering, "They are waiting for me." I almost screamed, shaking her awake. But she just looked at me with a strange look and fell unconscious. I knew, clearly, if I didn't do something soon, I would lose her forever. But how can a normal person like me fight against the burning souls in the darkness? Each day that passes, I only find myself being pushed deeper into a story with no way out. A nightmare that others may consider short, scary stories, but to me, it is real life falling apart piece by piece. After the night, Emily screamed in a voice that did not belong to her. I knew that this house was no longer a shelter, but a battlefield between 2 worlds. Every corner of the room, every door, every mirror seemed to be a gate leading to another place. Emily became more and more strange. Her eyes were often opaque and her gaze was empty. She rarely spoke to me, but sometimes she mumbled incomprehensible sentences as if she were talking to someone invisible. I could no longer distinguish between dreams and reality. The house was filled with strange phenomena that made me feel like I had stepped into one of the most terrifying paranormal stories. One evening, I saw Emily sitting in front of the bedroom mirror. She stared at her reflection, her lips moving, but no sound came out. I called her name, but there was no response. When I approached, the image in the mirror suddenly changed. It was no longer Emily, but a scorched face, white eyes, and a wide open mouth as if screaming. I recoiled, my heart pounding. When I looked back, there was only my wife in the mirror, but she was crying, tears streaming down her face. She whispered that they wouldn't let her go that they wanted her to be part of their family. I tried to find help. I contacted a group that specializes in paranormal research. When they heard my story, they seemed worried. One of the members said that the incident I described had all the signs of a complete possession. They advised me to leave the house immediately, but I couldn't leave Emily. She was getting weaker, but at the same time she seemed to be closely connected to the spirits. If I left, I was afraid that they wouldn't let her go and would take her with them. The next night, as Emily slept, I sat beside her and prayed. But just a few minutes later, the temperature in the room suddenly dropped. My breathing became hazy. The lights flickered, and a familiar voice rang out. "You cannot protect her." This time, it wasn't just Emily's mouth. It echoed throughout the room as if several people were speaking at once. On the walls, shadows began to move, forming the shapes of charred people. A tall figure stood at the foot of the bed, staring at me. I held up the cross, but at that moment, Emily opened her eyes, her gaze lifeless, and laughed in a voice that wasn't hers. I knew clearly that I was facing the souls left behind from the fire. After that incident, I felt like the house was no longer a place for the living. Even during the day, when the light was flooding in, I could still hear knocking, footsteps, and children's laughter coming from upstairs. Emily often woke up in the middle of the night, screaming as she felt a scorched hand pulling her down from the bed. I held her tight, but the bruises on my wrists and ankles proved that I couldn't protect her as I thought. I began to feel myself being pulled into this vortex. I hear whispers in my head when I'm alone. It feels like someone is always standing right behind me. When I look in the mirror, sometimes I see another face in the reflection. The face of a man I've never met, but who feels familiar. I understand that the line between the living and the ghosts is slowly disappearing in this house. And I know, clearly, we don't have much time left. If we don't find a way to stop it, Emily will disappear forever into the arms of darkness. After seeing the charred face in the mirror, I began to realize that this house was not only haunted, but also like a sick movie screen where the past replayed before our eyes. Horrifying images appeared and disappeared, leaving me with the feeling that I was living in a real-life, animated horror story. One night, I woke up to a strange noise from the living room. When I went downstairs, I was stunned. The whole room seemed to have turned into a stage of the past. The walls trembled, flames burst out of nowhere, and I could clearly see 4 charred figures running around. The screams of children echoed, the man screamed in pain, and Emily stood in the middle of the room, eyes wide open, motionless as if she had witnessed it all. I rushed to pull her out, but my foot touched the hot ash that covered the floor. In that moment, I knew that I was no longer dreaming, but truly stepping into the memories of the trapped souls. When I shook her, the vision disappeared, leaving only Emily unconscious in my arms. The next morning, she woke up with red eyes. She recounted exactly what I had seen, as if we had both entered the same dream, except that it was happening in real life. She said that the 2 children in the fire called her mother, and that the man had ordered her not to leave. I felt my blood run cold, because it was clear that Emily was being drawn to replace the woman who had died in the fire. The following days, the memory replays appeared more frequently. In the bedroom, I saw flickering streaks of fire spread across the wall, then disappear when I touched them. In the kitchen, I heard the sound of a knife scraping on a cutting board, even though no one was there. In the bathroom, the mirror blurred and showed images of charred faces, all looking at me as if trying to drag me down with them. I knew that this house had become a door, opening to the ghostly footage of the past playing over and over again, plunging us into a terrifying loop. Emily was getting weaker. Sometimes she spoke to me in a normal voice, but after a few minutes her voice became hoarse, and she started laughing eerily. She said she could hear them whispering all day long, even when she was awake. She said they were teaching her strange prayers, and if she said them, she would be with them forever. I was terrified, trying to stop them, but I knew the power of the darkness was growing. While my faith was slowly crumbling, another night I turned on the camera to record Emily sleeping. When I watched it, I saw her body was still, but her shadow on the wall moved. The shadow turned to look straight into the camera, its eyes burning, while Emily remained still. I threw the camera to the floor, not daring to watch anymore. This house had gone beyond imagination, becoming a living horror movie in which I was helpless. As the main character, I knew clearly that if I did not find a way, Emily would be swallowed whole. But how to fight against the burning memories and the souls that yearned for a living body? I could only pray that there would be a way out before we completely lost ourselves in the vortex of darkness. One weekend, Emily was taken away by her best friend for a few days to regain her spirits. I reluctantly agreed, thinking that leaving the house might help her recover. But that meant I had to stay alone in the house that had haunted us. The first night home, alone, I experienced the most terrible fear of my life. During the day, the house was as normal, sunlight streaming through the windows, everything was quiet. But when the sun set, the atmosphere changed completely. Darkness filled the room. Every corner of the room seemed to turn into a hiding place for invisible eyes. I tried to stay calm, turned on all the lights in the house, but the feeling of coldness still surrounded me. I sat in the living room, turned on the TV to create noise. But the noise was not enough to cover the slow footsteps coming from upstairs. I knew clearly that no one was there but me, but the sound continued, rhythmically as if someone was moving round the hallway. I gathered up my courage, grabbed a flashlight, and went to check. When I reached the second floor, the long hallway was dark, the flashlight beam hitting the old walls. I walked towards the bedroom, my heart pounding. The door opened slightly, the inside was empty, but the mirror on the dressing table reflected a figure standing right behind me. I turned around, there was no one. When I looked back at the mirror, the figure was still there, its white eyes staring. I was startled and dropped the flashlight. The flickering light made the figure disappear. I hurried back to the living room, but the situation was no better. The TV suddenly turned off, the black screen reflecting my face. In a split second, a charred face appeared right behind me on the screen, mouth open, screaming silently. I rushed to pull the plug, my heart pounding, but at that moment, a child's laughter rang out from the kitchen. I held my breath, every hair on the back of my neck stood up. When I entered the kitchen, I saw a chair dragged, leaving a long mark on the floor. The refrigerator door flew open, and items fell to the floor. Amidst the chaos, a hoarse voice rang out right next to my ear. "You shouldn't be here." I panicked and rushed to the bedroom, closed the door, and tried to lock it. But the knocking sounded 3 times regularly, then stopped. I sat still, cold sweat pouring down. That night, I didn't dare to sleep, just praying for the morning to come soon. The next morning, when Emily called to ask, I didn't dare to tell her the details, afraid that she would panic more. But in my heart, I knew that this house had confirmed its ownership. The silence during the day was just a trap to hide the nightmare at night. and I knew clearly that staying alone would only make me an easier target for the burned souls that still lurked in the darkness. That rainy night was one of the scariest nights I had ever experienced. It was pouring down, the sound of rain hitting the glass windows, mixed with the howling wind, making the whole house sink into a gloomy song. I sat in the living room, trying to reassure myself that the rain would drown out all the strange sounds that often appeared, but I was wrong. After only a few minutes, I realized that the sound of rain did not hide anything, but on the contrary, it was like a background curtain for other sounds to emerge more clearly. At first, I heard whispers mixed in with the sound of rain, very soft but steady, as if someone was standing right next to the window talking. I moved closer, pressed my ear to the glass, and my heart almost stopped. In the sound of rain, I clearly heard a child's voice calling Emily's name. It echoed, choked, as if coming from a faraway place. I stepped back, my heart pounding. Just then, Emily came down from upstairs, her eyes closed, but her mouth responding. Her voice mixed with the rain, a creepy conversation between two worlds. I called her name, but Emily did not answer. She stood right at the window, her hands on the glass, whispering continuously. I rushed to pull her back, but her whole body was cold as ice, her lips still moving words I did not understand. Suddenly, the glass door shook violently. Rain splashed, and in the moment of thunder and lightning, I saw the scorched shadows of two children pressed against the outside of the window, their white eyes looking inside. I panicked and pulled Emily away, but she screamed loudly. A deep, hoarse male voice rang out from her mouth. "They are mine." I held her tightly, trying to calm down, but the sound of the rain grew louder and louder, and the whispering turned into screaming. I heard many voices at once, the crying of children, the cries of women, and the growling of men. The whole house seemed to be in the rain, shaking with the sound coming from the other world. I felt like I was no longer sitting in the living room, but had been dragged into the night of the fire, where the souls of the tragic deaths were constantly repeating painful memories. When I tried to bring Emily back to the bedroom, all the lights in the house went out, leaving only the flickering light from the lightning outside the window. With each flash, I saw the charred figures standing in the hallway, growing more numerous, getting closer. I ran quickly, but the hallway seemed endless. My steps were heavy, as if stepping on floodwater. Emily jerked my hand, turned around to look at me with a strange gaze. She screamed in a strange voice, "You cannot save her," then collapsed to the floor, unconscious. I carried her into the room, trying to lock the door. Outside, the rain was still pouring heavily, but mixed in with it, I clearly heard ghostly laughter. That night, I sat by the bed, holding Emily's hand tightly, but in my heart I knew clearly the sound of rain was no longer a comfort. It became the soundtrack to a vivid nightmare, a sound that will haunt me for the rest of my life. I had read many creepypastas online, ghost stories made up to scare the reader, but I never thought that I would have to live in a story like that. Everything Emily and I experienced had traces of those horror legends, except for one thing. This was not fiction, but reality. That night, after the rain had stopped, the house was eerily silent. I sat in the living room, trying to read a book to distract myself, but only a few minutes later, I heard footsteps on the ceiling, slowly at first, then faster, as if someone was crawling back and forth right above my head. I quickly ran upstairs, but saw no one. When I returned to the living room, the ceiling light shook violently, then suddenly went out. In the darkness, I heard a soft laugh coming from the corner of the room. Emily appeared, her face pale, her eyes wide. She said in a strange voice, "They are here." Before I could react, all the windows shook, cold wind rushed in, and black shadows began to appear around the room. They moved slowly, their bodies scorched, their eyes glowing. I held Emily tightly, but she struggled away, as if controlled by an invisible force. She walked to the center of the room, raised her hands, and whispered strange words. I didn't understand the meaning, but each sound sent shivers down my spine, like a ritual repeated after decades. I screamed her name, but her eyes were empty, staring right through me as if she no longer recognized me. I rushed to pull her away from the invisible circle she was standing in, but at that moment, a scorched hand reached out from the darkness and gripped my shoulder. Heat spread through my body, my skin burning as if it had been burned by fire. I screamed in pain, and then the hand disappeared, leaving a red burn on my skin. Emily collapsed, unconscious. The next morning, when she woke up, she looked at me with red eyes. She said she remembered everything. In her dream, she stood in the middle of the burning room, listening to the man's voice ordering her to stay with them. 2 children clung to her legs, calling her mother. She felt like if she nodded, she would belong to them forever. I held her tight, but I knew the darkness was winning. I tried to find ancient documents, hoping to find a way to stop it. In an old book on the supernatural, I read a line that made my blood run cold. When a soul is burned in an unjust fire, it will seek a new body to be reborn. If the door is opened, it will never close again. I knew that door was Emily, and every night, the ritual was repeating itself, bringing us closer to the final disaster. The house now resembled a sick, creepypasta scenario, where everything was distorted by the darkness' own rules. I knew full well that if I didn't act soon, I would lose my wife and possibly my soul. I thought that perhaps leaving the house for a while would help Emily escape the darkness. So I decided to take her camping in a quiet forest far away from town. I chose a secluded spot, with only the sound of wind, rustling leaves, and night insects. I hoped that the fresh air would calm her mind, and the spirits would not be able to follow her out. At first, everything seemed fine. We set up a tent at the edge of the forest, lit a fire, and sat next to each other. Emily seemed to relax, sometimes smiling slightly as she looked into the fire. I felt my heart warm up after weeks of living in tension. But that hope only lasted until the night fell deeper. The wind began to pick up. The rustling of the forest leaves continued. I heard strange sounds in the wind, like footsteps on dry leaves. I looked around. The fire only illuminated a small area. The rest was pitch black. Emily whispered, "They found us." I shivered, holding her hand tightly, trying to reassure her that no one was there. But then, from the darkness came the familiar giggles of children, the sound that had haunted me many nights. I jumped up, shining my flashlight into the woods. Between the trees, I saw 2 small figures standing motionless, their eyes shining dimly in the light. When I blinked, they disappeared, leaving only silence. Emily trembled, staring into the fire, muttering in a strange voice, "They are calling me home." I couldn't sleep all night. The wind blew hard, shaking the tent. The fire flickered, and strange sounds echoed around the camp. Sometimes I heard someone whispering right next to my ear, but when I turned around, there was only eerie darkness. I held Emily tightly, but in my sleep, she laughed, a hoarse laugh that sent a chill down my spine. The next morning, we packed up to leave, But when I folded the tent, I found scorched footprints on the ground, as if someone had walked on it while the ground was still hot. I looked at Emily, who just bowed her head, saying nothing. I understood clearly. The darkness had followed us. No matter where we were, on the way back, in the heavy silence, I clearly felt that we could no longer escape. The camping trip was supposed to be about finding peace, but in the end it only confirmed a terrible truth. They would never let Emily go. After returning from the camping trip, I noticed that Emily had completely changed. She was quiet, often sitting silently for hours. Her eyes were empty and strange. There were times when I called her name many times without her responding, but as soon as a strange sound rang out in the darkness, she immediately startled and whispered in response. I began to understand that it was no longer just a dream or an external obsession, but Emily was truly haunted. Her body and soul were gradually becoming a shelter for the burned souls of the past. One night, I woke up to find Emily not lying on the bed. I went to look for her and found her standing in the middle of the living room, her head tilted to one side, her hair covering half of her face. When I approached, she slowly raised her face, her white eyes shining brightly. The voice that rang out was not hers, but a collection of overlapping voices. "She is not yours anymore." I shivered, standing there, dumbfounded. In that moment, I saw the charred figures lurking around the room, as if protecting my wife's body from me. I screamed, begging them to let go. But Emily immediately rushed forward and grabbed my neck with a strength I had never felt before. Her hands were cold, but tight like a vice. I was almost suffocating when she let go, collapsing to the floor. I held her in my arms, tears streaming down my face, knowing that the woman I loved was slowly being taken away from me the next day. I tried to take Emily to the church to see the priest, but as we walked through the church doors, she cowered, screaming in pain as if she were on fire. We had to turn back, and on the way back, she muttered that they wouldn't let her near the light. Those words made me despair, because I knew that they were taking her more and more. The next night, as I sat by the bed, Emily suddenly sat up, her eyes wide open. She looked straight at me and smiled, a crooked smile that was not hers. A man's voice echoed from her throat. "You cannot fight us. She belongs here." I picked up the cross and prayed. Emily screamed in pain, but it was not a human scream, but 100 souls screaming at the same time. The air in the room was so cold that my breath turned to mist. After that moment, Emily fell down, exhausted. But I knew clearly it was only temporary. I could stop it for a moment, but the truth was that her body had become a home for others. I sat in the dark, my hands shaking, my heart broken. I no longer knew if I was living in reality or in an endless nightmare. The house was no longer haunted. It had turned into a battlefield. And I knew that, if I didn't find a way, sooner or later I would lose everything. After long nights of laughter, crying, and scorched figures, I gradually understood a terrifying truth. This was not a fleeting phenomenon or the imagination of a haunted mind. This was a real story, one of the most terrifying true stories, and we were living it. Emily changed more and more each day. There were times when she was awake, looking at me with gentle eyes, but just a second later, her eyes turned cold and strange. One morning, when I entered the room, I saw her standing in front of the mirror, her hand drawing strange symbols with charcoal ash on the glass. When I tried to wipe them away, the drawings did not disappear but became deeper, as if engraved into the mirror. Emily looked at me, smiling with pale lips. "They are almost here. I was speechless, not knowing what to do but to tremble and pray. Another night, I heard a soft lullaby coming from the bedroom. I walked in and saw Emily sitting on the bed, eyes closed, her voice echoing like many people singing together. The room was cold, the light flickering. When she opened her eyes, they were empty, and the singing turned to screaming. The door slammed shut, and I was engulfed in a blast of cold wind. Ashes fell from the ceiling in patches, forming the shape of wailing faces. I screamed for help, but there was no one but me and Emily in the room that had turned into hell. I began to learn more about the history of the house. The pieces gradually became clear. The family that died in the fire were not just victims. There were rumors that the man had performed an evil ritual, forcing the family's souls to stay in the fire forever. And now, Emily became the new door for that ritual to continue. The whispers, the images that recurred in the night, all signs of an unstoppable return. I tried to tell a few close friends about it, but they looked at me skeptically. They thought I was paranoid because of the pressure. I don't blame them, because if they hadn't seen it with their own eyes, no one would believe that such a nightmare existed in real life. But I know clearly that this is not a fabrication. The bruises on Emily's body, the images I recorded with my camera, the burns on my skin, all are undeniable evidence. Tonight, as I sit here writing these lines, I hear footsteps in the hallway. Emily is sleeping next to me, but her lips are still moving, as if talking to someone. I know clearly that our story is no longer a legend, but a terrifying truth that happens every day. And perhaps, one day, we will no longer be here to tell it. But if anyone reads or hears it, remember that not all horror stories are fiction. There are true stories in real life, and they can reach anyone. I gradually realized that the presence in this house was not just to scare or take over Emily. Everything that happened seemed to be a carefully calculated revenge plan. The souls burned in the fire did not try to leave, but stayed to pay the blood debt that had never been resolved. And Emily was the next victim in the series of revenge stories that stretched from the past to the present. One evening, Emily suddenly burst into tears, saying that she heard women screaming in her head, their voices filled with resentment. They said that they had been betrayed, that the fire years ago was not an accident, but the price for a failed ritual. She described the scene where a man in that family tried to use human blood to bind the power, but the result only brought death to everyone. They could not leave, and now they wanted others to suffer the same fate to complete the curse. I shuddered when I heard it. I understood that Emily was becoming a conduit for those vengeful spirits. They wanted not only her, but me to witness, to make my despair part of their sick revenge. Another night, I woke to find Emily standing in the kitchen, knife in hand, eyes blank. She did not attack me, but carved strange symbols into the wooden table. I rushed to snatch the knife from her hand, but immediately heard screams from all sides. Burning figures appeared around me, their white eyes glowing in the darkness. A voice rang out, "You cannot erase what is owed." I was so scared that my hands shook, knowing I had just witnessed the declaration of an unstoppable vengeance. More and more, my dreams were invaded. I saw myself standing in the flames, Emily on the other side, being dragged away by figures. I ran after her, but my feet felt glued to the floor. A voice echoed in my head, "Now you know our pain." I woke up in a sweat, but the burning on my skin proved that it was no dream. I began to connect the dots. The fire was not just a tragedy, but a failed ritual, leaving behind vengeful spirits. They had waited for decades, until Emily appeared, weak and vulnerable. And now, it was repeating itself, like a never-ending revenge story. I knew that if I didn't find a way to end it, Emily would not only lose her soul, but I would also be drawn into this cycle of revenge. In despair, I sat by her bedside, watching the woman I loved slowly become a puppet for vengeful spirits. I held her hand tightly, but sometimes that same hand squeezed me so hard that it left bruises. I knew I didn't have much time left, and I feared that the end was closer than ever. On the last night, I knew something was about to happen. The air in the house was so heavy that I could hardly breathe. Each step echoed like in a giant tomb. Emily lay motionless on the bed, but her body was stiff, her eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. I held her hand, begging her to resist, but her lips only moved slightly. A strange voice rang out. "It is time," I understood. This was the moment when darkness decided to take over her completely. The room shook, objects fell and broke with a loud bang. The walls cracked, black smoke spewed from the cracks, carrying the acrid smell of fire. Burned figures appeared, this time no longer blurry but clear in every detail. The tall man stepped forward, his eyes burning like hot coals. He reached out to Emily, his mouth growling, "She belongs to us." I screamed, hugging my wife tightly, but immediately an invisible force threw me to the corner of the room. Emily jumped up, her body floating on the bed. Her eyes were white, her mouth opened wide, revealing an inhuman scream. Invisible flames erupted around her, forming a ghostly circle. I crawled over, grabbed the only remaining cross, and chanted the prayer with all my might. At first, my voice was shaky, but then it grew stronger. The flames around Emily flickered, the ghost screamed fiercely. Emily turned her head towards me, her eyes flashing. In that moment, I saw her real face appear behind the darkness. Her eyes filled with tears, as if begging me not to let go. I screamed, pouring all my last faith, forcing my strength into each word. The flames exploded, the room lit up. Screams resounded, the charred figures turned to ash, carried by the cold wind. Emily fell onto the bed, unconscious. When I ran to her, she was still breathing, but weakly. I held her tightly, tears falling. The room was strangely quiet, but I knew this was not the end. The door had opened, and once it opened, it would never completely close. Emily might have escaped this time, but the scars on her soul and body would never go away. I write this story as a warning to anyone who dares to disregard the darkness. This is not a legend, not a story to scare children. This is the truth, a true horror story, a revenge story, and above all, a story that is scary to the core. And if you hear whispers in the night, please remember, it may not be just the wind.